Welcome to the Out of Bounds Read podcast, where we help inform and grow the community around common weakness enumeration and common attack pattern enumeration and classification. This podcast is produced by the MITRE Corporation with funding from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency.
Hi, my name is Steve Batista. I'm here with Larry Cashdollar as my guest, who is a prolific CVE writer. And my questions to him are about the types of weaknesses he found in those CVEs. Welcome, Larry.
How have you been?
Oh, I've been doing well. So one of the things that I'm starting to realize is that when I interact with people, a lot of people conflate the fact of weaknesses with only buffer overflows. And since you are an individual CVE numbering authority and you find a lot of CVEs, what are the types of weaknesses that you find in those CVEs?
Well, we could talk about when I first started finding CVEs in the late 90s. Back then, it was more of server type stuff, like race conditions and /temp, buffer overflows, and things like that. These days, the landscape has changed dramatically. You have the web has become dynamic, very dynamic in the last 20 plus years. Um, you know, Back in the day, you just had static web pages, and if you wanted to deface a website, you needed to hack the server. These days, the web is so dynamic. If you want to deface a website, you've either got to bypass authentication or you've got to try and find a unauthenticated file upload. So, or even SQL injection. There's so many more different ways to find a security vulnerability because the web has just changed completely from what it was back 30 years ago. These days, if you're looking to find a CVE, you'll find things like SQL injection, you'll find authentication bypass, you'll find local file inclusion, you'll find path traversal, you'll find unauthenticated unauthenticated file uploads and things like that. Um, it's The web has just gotten so big, it's just sort of outweighed more of the binary exploitation that you'd see with a buffer overflow or like a something that was not web based. And even saying like now there's memory safe languages like Java. Uh, we just had an incident with Log4j, which is based in a Java language, and that took a massive toll on the internet. That wasn't a memory corruption bug. That was just a bug that was a little bit too. It was a little bit too easy to manipulate the input to get the server to. It's too trusting. It's just it wasn't something that was a coding error. It was a feature that was just too insecure.
Yeah,
So
it's much more of a flaw than a bug. I mean, it was actually designed intentionally because it had some feature ability in it. And I didn't think people thought that they could use that feature in a malicious way.
right. So
Mhm.
it's things like that have become the big problem of today. Uh, some of the things that I found that were interesting were roll your own encryption. I discovered a web application that processed log files, and the author decided to write his own encryption algorithm for the passwords. That's always a bad idea,
So he
especially
wasn't storing them as a hash, he was storing them as an encrypted thing.
it was a simple ciphertext,
Oh,
um,
okay.
one that you would create as a kid to in quote unquote encrypt messages to your friends, where it was just a simple substitution cipher. So R was Q and Z was
Okay.
L and A was 5, and
It was a little bit more complex than ROT 13, but
it
basically a Caesarean Caesar cipher, I believe. I think it's called, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And this was, this was in production level internet facing software. So it's things like that that um, I enjoy finding, but you're kind of shocked to find something like that.
So are you finding that these bugs or flaws are part of the base developers or part of the a misconfiguration on the user's end?
It's mostly developers where the developer is an expert in their programming language, but they have little to no understanding of secure programming. Um, I had a friend of mine who I hadn't seen since elementary school had written he became a web developer, and we caught up with each other 30 plus years later over Facebook. And he's like, Larry, how have you been? He's like, what are you doing with yourself? And I'm like, oh, I'm in internet security now. And he's like, are you one of those hacker guys? And I'm like, well, kind of, but not really. And I said, I'm the good kind. And he's like, oh, well, I became this web developer, and I developed PHP websites for, I think it was restaurants. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool, And he's like, would you be able to hack one of my websites? And I'm like, oh, probably not, And he's like, I bet you couldn't. And I'm like, okay, challenge accepted. And I started, you know, poking at his websites, putting in like backticks and stuff in his user input, and it was full of SQL injection. And I'm like, hey man, I'm like, your site has SQL injection. And he's like, what is that? And I'm like, well, this is where, if I put in certain characters that are interpreted by the database, I can inject SQL commands into the back end of the database and pull different things from your table and possibly get code execution and things like that. And he's like, I've never heard of that. And he's like starts reading about it, and he's like, holy cow. He's like, dude, he's like, you're dangerous. And I'm like, I'm not dangerous. I'm like, this is just, common practice for secure programming. So then he went through and secured all of his websites that he had written, and then came
He
back to me.
sanitized his inputs for
Yes, he
SQL.
sanitized his inputs, and he prepared his SQL statements and fixed all of his sites. And he's like, I never knew any of this stuff. And he's a good PHP programmer. He just didn't understand the the malicious side of accepting input from untrusted sources. And now he understands, and he thinks about keeping his stuff secure when he writes things now.
Is
And
this analogous to civil engineers who I don't think we should have professionals, but need to have an engineering professional certification before they build stuff like large buildings for human beings? Is just they just don't know.
yeah, it does seem like that. So and I'm not immune from it either. I confessed a couple of years ago I had written a web server in C, and um, as trying to hone my skills in C programming and actually not forget C programming after I had left college. So I decided I'm going to write this web server and maintain it, and that would keep my C skills going for years as long as I use this web server. And I had one of my friends who is he's pretty elite hacker guy compared to me. He's does a lot of kernel coding and exploitation, and a lot of buffer overflows, and all this stuff that he would do back in the earlier days. He doesn't do any of that anymore. But I'm like, here, I'm like, I'm going to set up my web server, and I'll send you the source, and you hack it. And he's like, okay. And he comes back next. He's like, well, I found code execution unauthenticated. I'm like, what? And he's like, yeah. And then I'm like, what the? He's like, if you go in and if you type, get, and then you put, two dots, I'm like, path traversal? He's like, yeah. And I'm like,
Mhm.
what the heck did I do? And I'm looking at the source code, and I had commented out the actual functions that were supposed to check for path traversal and check for any sort of malicious input, because I had disabled that because I was testing my server behind Akamai's WAF, and I didn't want my web server um, alerting to any of the attacks that I was sending, and I was letting Akamai's WAF do it. And I left that function disabled in my production code for years. and didn't realize it. So I'm not
Yeah.
immune to it depends on what your mindset is. And at that time, my mind was developing code and I had forgotten about the security part. So
Yeah, I've learned that I cannot audit my own code because I have a mental framework of how it's supposed to work so
yeah,
that I can build it. And I
yeah,
need someone who doesn't have that framework of how it's supposed to work to see how it really does work. Because you
right.
get so, at least I do, I get so wrapped up into, oh, this is exactly how it should be because I'm constructing it. And you don't think about the extraneous what ifs.
Right. And I
So is
guess
that one of the recommendations is to have a different person that constructs the code look at it?
that's recommended. That would be my recommendation for myself. I know there's other developers out there that can do both, but I am not one of those people where I don't I wouldn't really trust myself to write code that I would be running an internet system on, like a major service. I can trust it for my own website because I'm not worried about performance or things like that. I am worried about security, but at that time I had I had neglected the fact of that function being called out and completely forgot, because this is a hobby of mine to work on this piece of code. It's not my day-to-day job, so I had left it I had left it unattended for months and completely forgot that I'd been doing testing. But I think if you're the type of developer that can re-audit their code and step through it and think of it differently, then that's great. But it wouldn't work for me. I think I'd need
So
someone else to look at it.
so that brings up something you said in the past. In the log4j example, some of that stuff is open source and is free. Is there any
Right.
recommendations you have on how to help improve the open source community? I mean, we really owe those people a debt of gratitude for doing stuff for free, right? It's fun. You feel like you're making a difference, but how do we help them build better code?
I think companies that use open source software should think about sponsoring open source software that they use. If you're using a certain project and you're this big corporation, you might want to think about sponsoring that open source project. Either through funds or actually contributing to the Git pulls and whatnot. I think that would be a major help for these
Mhm.
for these one or two-person teams that are building stuff. Um, I know a lady who was running she runs a GitHub for, I believe it's a vulnerability management tracking framework. And I think she has maybe one or two people that help with her, but she has many companies that use her software. And she, I don't believe, is getting anything in return for that. She just does it to contribute to the community. And it would be nice if companies would contribute in some way more than just using or consuming the efforts by these developers.
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting in going through this is I learned that sudo is not part of the Linux kernel. It's actually run mostly by this one gentleman who's been working on it for 30 years. And so there was a vulnerability in sudo. And when when someone like you or me who have been in this career forever say, what do you mean some random person runs sudo? It's important to the entire ecosystem. And it
Right.
just surprises me sometimes.
Right. It's been something that we've used for decades, and you just assume that it's this thing that's been there for ages, and it has a whole team behind it, but you find out that it's some really useful tool that one person is working on. So
Right. And then kudos for this person who basically helped me have my entire career, but it's just amazing that it's this person built this thing.
right.
Are there any other pieces of recommendation that you have to people who are developing code that they should go through so that to make your life harder in finding vulnerabilities?
Uh, it's definitely, read up on secure programming. Whatever language you're in, they're not all immune to security vulnerabilities or things like that. You have to look at what types of vulnerabilities might impact your programming language. You're not going to be thinking about buffer overflows if you're using a memory safe language, but you might be worrying about um, whether that file upload function that you've created to, for your website is going to check whether you are uploading an image or a PHP script and where it's placing that uploaded file. Is it putting it in the path of the web server where someone can potentially find it and execute code, or is it sticking it off in another storage location that can't be reached through the web interface? There's all sorts of things to think about when you're developing software, and that revolves also around what language you're developing it in.
Yeah, and I think that applies to all teams. I mean, I think back to the big Zoom vulnerability a while back, and it was a path traversal. You were uploading stuff, and you could figure out how to upload something that overwrote some part of the critical part of Zoom's control by saying, oh, put it in this directory that you shouldn't really have access to.
Right. I mean, it's, web applications have gotten way more complex than they were when, the web just started becoming dynamic in probably the late 90s, early 2000s. I remember when things were starting to get dynamic where, when I was in college in the late 90s, you just went to a website with static HTML. And then I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, I remember going to a website and it knew the web's page knew where I was based on my IP address. And I thought that was the coolest thing because that was new and I was unexpected. And that was like sort of the dawn of these, web applications that were way more interactive than they were and aware of the user than they were, before then. So,
I used to be able to say I know how to build websites because I could write HTML, and that is no longer a true statement. Like, even if I was the best HTML raw writer, I really don't know how to do websites. You look at MSN.com or something, and those websites are huge. The amount of scripts and stuff that winds up getting downloaded is amazing.
Yeah, I say I build ugly, horrible websites. They're dynamic, but they're ugly. They're hard on the eyes. They're functional. That's it. They're not elegant. That's for true web developers to do.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with, the general developer community about what they should be doing to, remove weakness or prevent weaknesses from becoming vulnerabilities in their systems?
It's good to have, if you're lucky to have a team and to have, each other check each other's code. I know some folks aren't, as lucky. They're one person shop where they're building things, but it's good to take a step back and then come back later and look at stuff, and just figure out what the user inputs, where it's going, and what it's doing, and then try and think like a bad guy. I've said that before, to other people, is when you're trying to build something, think how it could be abused. If you're building an application that takes input and it's, are you trusting that input? You shouldn't be. That's all sort of things. If I were a bad person, what would I put in here that could possibly cause unexpected behavior in my project that I'm building?
Yeah, I've been in those review meetings where the developer says, but no one in their right mind would ever do that.
Yes.
And that's usually, that's exactly what they're going to do.
That's exactly what you need to do, is do what that person is going to do.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Larry.
Sure. It was great talking to you.
Thank you for listening to the Out of Bounds Read podcast, available on most podcast platforms and at cwe.miter.org. Stay up to date and connect with us on Twitter at CWEKPEC. Until next time, take care.